So a Pearl study from earlier this year said that 41% of Gen Z trust AI more than humans in the workplace. Do you think this over reliance on artificial intelligence is killing our intuition?
I mean, I worry about that. I definitely worry about that. We're so, we've got this like focus nowadays on data and algorithms and AI. And, I think what we forget is that underlying that is still humans, right? It's still humans that need to program things. It's still humans that need to take the data and be able to slice and dice it and interpret it in different ways. And so I think when we start to have our first reaction be, okay, let's use AI, let's use algorithms, we start to lose a little bit of that natural creativity, that natural wonder that I think is so important for honing our gut feel and our intuition and being able to trust a lot of the experience and the expertise that we naturally have.
Yeah, and just to kind of go back, you mentioned gut feeling. So is gut feeling intuition? Is that a synonym? Is that the same thing
Yeah.
even?
So they're actually very different things, right? We use them so synonymously. We tend to say, oh, it was my gut, it was my intuition. But actually, what I find in my research is that they're two very different things. And the more we can understand how they're different, the better we're going to be able to train our gut feel to help us make decisions. And so intuition is actually the process, right? There is a process and there is an outcome. And what happens is there's an intuiting process. And during that intuiting process, what we're doing is we're allowing our personal experiences, our expertise, the external data that might be there. We're letting it all sort of interact. We're absorbing all of those things during this process. And then at some point during this process, there is an outcome. There's a discrete judgment that we have. And that's what's called the gut feel. That's our gut feel. And so it's tricky sometimes because that intuiting process sometimes lasts 2 seconds. Sometimes it lasts 20 years. But at some point there is a outcome and that's our gut feel. So intuition is that process. And then there is the gut feel that results from it.
Got it. And okay, there's a couple of ways I want to go there, but
Yeah.
just one thing
Yeah.
that just came to my mind is, so Yuval Harari, he talks about what makes humans humans versus animals, and he really talks about humans' ability to coordinate, communicate, believe in stories that kind of allows us to work together in mass through the societal norms or contracts, and that's
Uh-huh.
kind of how we've evolved. Do you think intuition or gut feeling is this a human feeling, human instinct, or is this something that goes across different mammals and different animals, or is it more of a human thing?
Yeah, no, I think it's definitely a mammalian thing, right? Like it's an
Mammalian, okay.
animal thing, right? It's not just humans who sort of have this, right? And one way to sort of think about it is like, the human. So what makes us, any living sort of creature, right? We have these, we adapt, right? We have prototypes, we have schemas, we learn from experience, right? So you can even imagine like animals, right? They learn from experience that, hey, when we're in an open field and, it's more likely that we're going to be hunted, for example, right? And so you start to pick up on these nuances. You start to pick up on these like experiential sort of things that I think is not just unique to humans. The difference is that, as humans, we have the ability to uniquely understand our own perspectives and maybe go a little bit deeper in terms of honing and harnessing and training what our gut feel is, right? So we have the ability to sort of understand where is this flash of clarity maybe coming from, right? Whereas certain animals might just know that there's a flash of clarity, but not actually do the searching or the self-awareness piece of it. I mean, maybe some of them do, right? I don't know exactly to what extent, but I think as humans, what we can understand is that we're an active part of this. And not only are we an active part of it, it's very unique to each of us individually, right? So sometimes people ask me like, what is gut feel, right? And there is a definition, but it's not necessarily the right question even, right? It's not even what is gut feel, it's who is gut feel, because gut feel is you. Your gut feel in a particular circumstance might be very different from my gut feel in that same circumstance. And that makes sense. And that's actually what makes it so powerful. The fact that I'm carrying with me my own interpretation of the data, my own experiences, my own expertise, my own culture, my own background, even my own trauma, all of that is aggregated into this executive summary that allows me to make decisions perhaps in a very different way than you do.
In relation to that, speaking of humans or mammalians having gut feeling, when we're talking about AI and perhaps with the future, I'm sure you're familiar with Neuralink and how, transhumanism and the connection of technology and humans. Where does that take the future of gut feeling or gut instincts when we're merging those two together? I mean, can AI in some sense, could you codify and explain that also has a gut feeling, because you're just kind of gathering previous data and collecting it, and then based on that, it's kind of deciding which way the car goes or which advice to give based on the LLM models. How do you think about that? Just because you're also based in Boston, you're right near MIT with the tech centers of robotics and everything. How do you think about that?
I think that all of these innovations, like around Neuralink, AI, all of that, they're extremely powerful. They're extremely powerful and they're extremely valuable. The question is, when are they valuable and when are they not? When can they actually do what humans do and better versus where are the limits to what they can do, right? So one way to think about this is there are many different types of problems out there, right? There are basically 4 categories of problems, right? There are simple problems, there are complicated problems, there are complex problems, and there are chaotic problems. Okay, so if we take simple problems, there is a probabilistic solution to that, right? There is a yes, no, binary, right, wrong type of solution to simple problems, right? So we don't need our gut feel for those simple problems. In fact, if we used our gut feel for it, we might be wrong, or at best, we would be redundant with a machine or with AI or Neuralink or any of these sort of things that are out there, right? And then we have complicated problems. Complicated problems seem, complicated, but what they really are is just a series of simple problems. They're just simple problems that are sort of stacked on top of each other. So there's still a solution for each of those isolated simple problems. But when you put it all together, sometimes we do use our gut feel for those complicated problems because we get lazy or it's too time consuming to actually solve each of those simple problems. Or maybe we personally don't have the expertise, or it would take too long for us to learn a certain area or a certain function. And so we often then use our gut feel for those complicated problems. That's where, the whole literature around heuristics and biases, right? Things like anchoring bias and sunk cost bias and all these things come in, right? Because we take shortcuts when there actually is a probabilistic or an actual solution, right? So for both of those types of problems, algorithms, AI, all of those things are actually better, right? If we were to be using our gut feel, again, it would either steer us in the wrong direction because we would fall prey to heuristics or these other things, or at best, we would be slower and more redundant than what a machine could do.
Can we give examples specifically? So like, what is a simple problem? Is it like choosing which egg to buy in your typical grocery store? And then a complex problem is like, what can you kind of distinguish the two, especially when we get to complex versus complicated? I think that might be synonyms.
Yeah, in terms of complicated problems, right? So simple problems are just, right, like, okay, well, we have the data. We know, like, the data shows that it's the answer should be red and not blue, right? It's something very simple, like, okay, a coin flip, there's a 50% chance that the coin is going to flip, right? So if you think about like probabilistically, right, you have a 1 in 2 chance of the coin sort of, right? And so at some point you can use your gut feel for that. You can be like, I think it's going to always be heads, and maybe you'll be right a couple of times, but just as you average it out across many, many different coin flips, right? That's the sort of complicated thing. You're just stacking different things, or maybe now you have weighted coins, and now you have balls, and now you have discs, and now you have all these sort of things. And you might be like, okay, well, I'm going to use my gut feel for this because I don't really understand discs rather than coins, or I don't understand, but there's somebody who understands discs, right? And so there are a lot of decisions that are sort of just a series of simple problems, right? But then there are complex and there are chaotic problems where at best you would be able to get 80% of the information that you needed to make that decision at best, right? More likely it's around 20% or something. And so there we do need to rely on our intuition and our gut feel, because there is no sort of right answer. There is no sort of, it's really based on many other things. And so algorithms can attempt to, and I'll give you some examples because I know it's a little bit abstract still, but algorithms can attempt to predict, and yet you change one variable, right? And the entire equation now needs to change, right? And that algorithm was programmed using that one equation with multiple different variables in that equation, maybe hundreds, thousands. But now you're changing one key variable. And so everything now has to change, right? So I'll give you an example. So one of the people that I talk about in my book was a man named Ron Johnson, right? He was a very well-known businessman, very smart man, but yet he became the CEO of JCPenney, and within 18 months was fired from his job, and JCPenney went bankrupt, right? So we sort of know what happened with JCPenney, this retail store. And he's also labeled, the biggest failure of the 21st century, right? And no one really wants to be called the biggest business failure of the 21st century. And so, a lot of people are thinking like, how did it become, because if you actually think about him, he was actually tremendously successful before he became the CEO of JCPenney, right? He started out first at Target, another retail store. And so when he was at Target, it was in the early days of Target, and he was responsible for turning Target into what we now know as like Target, right? Like I could blindfold you and put you in the middle of a Target store, take your blindfold off, and within 30 seconds, would you recognize where you were? Would you know where you were, right? The answer is probably yes. He was responsible for the design, the layout. He brought in specialized designers like Rachel Ray Cookware and Massimo Dutti clothing and all of these things. So he was so responsible for the success of this retail store, right? He then went on to Apple, right? And the same, right? Sean, I could ask you, could I blindfold you, put you in the middle of an Apple store, take your blindfold off, and would you know within 30 seconds where you were?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. And so Ron Johnson also was responsible for the design, the layout, the look and feel of Apple stores, right? He was the creator of the Genius Bar, right? At the back of the Apple store, where you roll up if you're having tech issues and you go to the Genius Bar. So he had all of this tremendous success in retail. And then he went to JCPenney, and, the stock price shot up when he was put in as CEO, all of these things. And algorithms, right? If you look at all of the things that Ron Johnson did at did at Target, and all of the things that he did at Apple in terms of the design of the store, the layouts, all of the things he sort of brought in, would have told you that it would made perfect sense for Ron Johnson to be successful at JCPenney. And yet what algorithms, or what those sort of experts or AI would not have been able to tell you, is that there was a critical variable that had shifted, right? That at Target and at Apple, he was facing this sort of opportunity gap, right? Where he could sort of take it from where it was and elevate it to something else. But at JCPenney, he really needed to just like stop the bleeding. They were losing sort of revenue. But, no one would have really known that, because you take all of the other variables, the fact that he had this experience, he was really good at retail, he knew what he was doing, all of those sort of things, but you would not have been able to identify this unless you really truly used your intuition and were able to kind of understand the limits of someone's experience, understand the data that's actually there, understand where we fall prey to situational arrogance, right? Where do we make mistakes? Where do we try and take something where we were successful at one point and now do the same thing where we might be situationally arrogant, right? All of those things are a piece of that. So we have lots of examples. Happy to give you more examples, or I can save some of those for some of the other things that we might be chatting about here.
Yeah. My first thought when I hear that is this kind of idea that perhaps in some ways our gut instincts could actually hurt us in a situation like this. Like this idea of what got you here won't get you there is pretty a common analogy, especially in the world of business where I am, where, going from 0 to 1 is a completely different roadmap than 1 to 2, 1 to 10, 100%.
1 to 100, 1 to 1,000, and so on. Yeah.
Exactly. And perhaps like we often fool ourselves thinking that, the person that we hired from 0 to 1 is the same person we should hire for going from 1 to 2 or 1 to 10. So where do we maybe backwards a little bit is
that's the situational arrogance that I was talking about, right?
Yes.
That, like, if we were really good at sort of building the firm, if we were really good at that 0 to 1 getting there, we sometimes assume that we have what it takes to really grow and scale the company, but it's a very, very different skill set, right? And so a lot of times we are experts in something, and yet even when we're experts at something, we don't recognize all of the signals or the nuances that really might lead us astray, right? And so, in sort of understanding how do we train our gut feel? How can we be better, right? Because that's part of that process that I spoke about earlier, right? So, one of the things that I suggest, and in the book, I have lots of sort of practical exercises and ways that people can hone and harness and train their gut feel. But one of the things I talk about is like, it's important for us as experts, especially when we have deep expertise in an area, to be able to to harness the ability to think like a novice, right? To have that expert perspective, but bring in that novice piece of it so that we're constantly having this push and pull between where our expertise lies and where we might be getting other variables because of that novice perspective, right? So I'll give you a super simplistic example, but, and then I'll explain how you can kind of, how the analogy applies to other parts of your life. But let's say, you're right-handed, okay? And you brush your teeth every night with your right hand because you're right-handed, right? So you are an expert at brushing your teeth, right? You're an expert at lots of other things, but you're an expert at brushing your teeth. So let's say that one night I tell you, okay, tonight you're going to brush your teeth with your left hand, right? And when you start, but you're still an expert at brushing your teeth, but in brushing your teeth with your left hand, you now notice different things, right? You're like, oh, wow, like this part of my gums kind of hurts. And like, you know what? I usually miss this part of my mouth and I don't brush as well in this part of my mouth. And this tooth like is bothering me and I never noticed it before. You start to have a view. You start to notice different things, even with your expert, even from that expertise point of view. And in doing so, you are now training yourself to not fall prey to situational arrogance. You're starting to notice other nuances that are involved with the field you really knew, or an area that you've been familiar with for decades. And so I talk about, you can do this not just with brushing your teeth, but you can do this in all sorts of different facets of your life, right? And so that's an example of how we truly can train our gut feel. We can train ourselves not only to recognize what gut feel looks like, right? How does it manifest generally? How does it arise individually? And what is the process that it's drawing from to get us there?
Mm. Can you kind of lay over what are some of the different types of intuitions or gut feelings?
Yeah.
And
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. So, as I mentioned, like we all have individual gut feel, right? So you might feel something like in the pit of your stomach, right? And I might like feel it in my neck, for example, or you might like get excited and then I might feel like anxiety, right? So we feel it differently. Okay. But there are 3 types of gut feel that is common to us all, right? And so I'll explain this a little bit, but the 3 types of gut feel that are common to us all are eureka moments, spidey sense, and jolts, right? And so what I mean is that we both have eureka moments, but your eureka moment might be like this like, aha kind of thing. And my eureka moment might be like, oh man, I'm starting to feel like sweaty and like, kind of nervous, right? So it presents itself differently, but we all share the same, where gut feel manifests in those 3 forms: the eureka moments, the spidey sense, and the jolts. So eureka moments are truly those sort of aha moments, right? Like we might have been puzzling over something, or there's some problem that we are trying to solve, and then all of a sudden we see something, or we hear something from on the side, or somebody says something and it's a catalyst. We then like notice something that we never noticed before. And then it's like, aha, we have this eureka moment. I know exactly what I should name my company, or I know exactly the way to solve this problem. Spidey sense, on the other hand, are this sort of like mismatch. Something feels off, right? Something from, we know what we believe, but now there's some signal that makes us think, like something is off. It's that uncomfortable, what's sort of happening kind of feeling. And then jolts are this like, whoa feeling, right? Like, whoa, like what is happening? Something triggers, or something is catalyzed, but it changes the very fundamental way that we have thought about something in the past. We now have a completely different way of thinking about something, or thinking about someone, or envisioning. It's really just shifting us and bringing us to this different level of abstraction, right? And so those are the 3 ways that gut feel presents itself and manifests, but we all might feel it differently, physically or emotionally or cognitively, when it arises in ourselves.
Yeah. And do you think that all of our instincts and gut feelings arises from the previous experiences that we've had, or are they somewhat passed down from our ancestors as more of an evolution or a survival instinct? Speaking about spidey sense, because I always find it interesting that like when babies, or when we ourselves, we're looking up from down in a building, we're like extremely afraid. We have that gut instinct where like goosebumps come in, or if we see a spider or a snake. Yet at the same time, or even when we fly, we're often more scared. But we get in a car every single day, and the statistics share that when you get in a car, you're much more likely to get in an accident and die versus a plane. So there's like certain things that our intuitions have been wired, it feels, to survive, to keep us alive. So how much of that is just from our actual experiences versus passed down from our ancestors for survival?
Yeah, it's both. I mean, it's both. There are definitely things that are, evolutionary kind of signals that are presenting themselves to us, but there's also a lot that's learned, and it is based on our own personal experiences over time, right? It's the same reason why children, maybe we naturally have that, like that goosebump sort of moment, but children also see a flame of a fire, right? And they don't understand that it's hot. And so they might see it's pretty colors and that sort of thing, and want to go and touch it, right? And so it's also those sort of learned behaviors. You get closer, up, it feels hot, I don't want to touch it, it hurts, right? Those sort of things. So it's both. And I think that's why, that process is so important, because a lot of times we think about things, or we want to even think about gut feel in a linear way. So much of what we do is linear. Like we read books, right? From page 1 to 2 to 3 to 200, right? We check things off. Like we look at a to-do list, and we're like, okay, we're going to do this and this and this. Or we think about our lives and our career trajectories in a linear fashion. So much of what we process cognitively, we try and do linearly, or we try and organize linearly. And yet, part of what makes gut feel so special, but also so difficult to understand and master, is the fact that it's anything but linear, right? It's actually not linear at all. And in fact, when we try and be linear about it, we end up talking our way out of a decision that we probably should have not made should have made in the first place, or shouldn't have made, right? Depending on the situation. Because gut feel is so nonlinear in the sense that we might be making a decision by combining something that we literally just read in a magazine, a piece of data that we saw yesterday, some statistic, and some experience that we had when we were 5 years old, right? And another experience that we had when we were 15 years old, for example. And we have no idea why those three pieces came together in a way that they did. But really, it's because there are so many synapses and nodes that are interconnected and clustering together in our brains that are making us notice certain signals, or certain senses are heightened in different areas. And really, we're combining all of that into a comprehensive, factor or flash of clarity that is not linear at all.
I'm curious to get your thoughts on the tendency for us when we're relying on gut instincts, given that if gut instincts were primarily, not primarily, but certainly a factor of helping us survive and live longer, my intuition is that these gut instincts are often trying to mitigate the downsides. So when we're often relying on our gut instincts, is that what we're trying to do? Are we being more pessimistic rather than optimistic when we're relying on gut instincts, where we're trying to mitigate the loss rather than trying to maximize potential gains? Is that kind of where our brain tends to go to?
I mean, instincts are very different, right? Instincts are very biological, right? That we don't necessarily even know where it comes from. Whereas intuition and gut feel, what I sort of study is that it's actually it is quantifiable. It might not be quantifiable in the way that we think, but like you can quantify the unquantifiable, right? And so you can start to understand that, you might be somebody who is more attuned to loss aversion than somebody else. It's not that we're all attuned to loss aversion, but you in particular might be, because as a child, you had a favorite toy that was taken away and that hurt you a lot, versus, when you got the new toy, it didn't feel as rewarding, right? You can actually pinpoint where you are on that continuum. But, the fact that we tend to notice losses more than we like losses sort of feel more weighty to us than gains. That's one of those heuristics that I've talked about. That's one of those things that, when we notice that and we take that into account, it also helps us make decisions in different ways. But that's not those complex or chaotic decisions. Then those those complex and chaotic decisions might be in the form of those spidey senses. Oh, something doesn't feel right here. But that something doesn't feel right can actually be for huge gains. It doesn't have to be just like, oh, I'm like trying to avoid this dark alley. And spidey senses can actually be used for huge gains. It's just this feeling of something doesn't sit well. There's an incongruence between what I know and what I'm hearing now. I'll give you a quick example of this, right? So there was a startup founder that I know really well, and he had a gaming company, right? It was a company that was based in New York, and they had a number of successful games. And this game was being bought by a very large multinational gaming company in the Bay Area in California. You can probably guess, some of the companies that I'm talking about, but I'll try and keep it anonymized for now. But so you had a smaller company based in New York and a large kind of conglomerate gaming company based in California. And they had agreed on an acquisition price, right? And it was a $30 million acquisition that the New York company was going to be selling to this California company. And so everything was all set, and they came together. The founder of the company was ready to sign. And all of a sudden he had this this weird, the founder of the California, the lawyers in the California company were like, yeah, how's the weather in New York? We're looking forward to something around like the weather in New York. Right. And something about the contrast between the weather in New York and California. And all of a sudden, the founder of this small company in New York had this like spidey sense, like something didn't sit well. Right. And what he realized was like what was sitting well was like they didn't seem to care about the games that he had worked so hard to develop, his sort of babies, like the product itself. And so he quickly realized that the acquisition was completely based on them wanting to have the presence in New York. This company in California wanted to sell a good growth story to Wall Street. They wanted to quickly acquire this company in New York. It was almost like an acqui-hire, like kind of situation where they wanted the talent in New York. They wanted the base in New York, but they didn't really care about the games or the product or the technology at all. And what this founder also realized was that our company is way more valuable than $30 million because $30 million is based on the tech. It's not based on the fact that they're all in one shot getting this huge presence in New York, all of these talented game developers in New York, that they can sell this huge growth story to Wall Street about how they're acquiring and now they're coast to coast and all these sort of things. And so the founder was like, I just had this gut feel. And so I said right before signing, I said, I'm out. I don't want to sell anymore. And then the California conglomerate was like, oh my gosh, what? Like, and the New York founder was like, yeah, I was really sweating at that point because I thought I was going to be losing $30 million. But his risk paid off, that spidey sense paid off, and he ended up selling the company for $120 million.
Wow.
Just based on understanding that the actual value was based on something that was not fitting. It was something that was incongruent, right? And so that's, again, points to what you're speaking about in terms of loss aversion and gains. It's not necessarily about this instinct that's telling us, okay, we're losing out on the 30 million. Oh, no, we better sign quickly. What doesn't feel right? It's about something feels incongruent. And because I've trained and honed my gut feel, I can quickly understand that the prompt was them asking about the weather in New York, which then linked up with all of the experiences that I had around the game, this company, what was happening on Wall Street, what was happening in terms of acquisitions and talent and development. And all of that was sort of silently, intuitively in that process accounted for.
Yeah, that's a $90 million gut intuition.
Feel, right? Yeah. It's a huge gain. Yeah.
Interesting. Yeah. I remember Bezos often says that when the data and the anecdotes disagree, the anecdotes are usually right. And the data doesn't always tell the full story. And then we have to rely on these intuitions that we've gained over time. I'm curious, you talked about loss aversion. I think you kind of mentioned recency bias there. There's a lot of cognitive biases that we have, right? One of my favorite books is from Poor Charlie's Almanac from Charlie Munger, and he talks about, I think there's like 21 cognitive biases, psychological biases that we have as humans, and it's all around us every single day, from media, from what we've been taught from our parents, school, all of these different things. And I wonder how much of that actually fogs the ability to have a positive outcome when it comes to intuition versus biases and emotions.
Those are like very unrelated to, those are those complicated problems that we're talking about, where you do have a counterfactual. You do know that there was one of these cognitive biases. I fell prey to this cognitive bias. If I hadn't, X would have happened. Because I did, Y happened, right? But in these like chaotic and complex situations that we're in, we don't have the counterfactual. We don't know what would have happened if we had done the other thing, right? And so, it's tricky. This is where, again, that nonlinear piece comes in. Yeah. What makes your gut feel right is that you've taken action. You've taken action on that gut feel. And then as time progresses, or as you make that decision the right one for you, you are doing all of these other things you're putting in all of these fixes to make your gut feel something that you can trust all the time, right? Gut feel is about action. It's about allowing you to take action. It's about that flash of clarity that inspires you then to do something and make that decision the right one, right? So, an example of this is like, I had a student who was, one of my students was telling me this story, and he was in his country's special forces military, okay? And he was like very, very high up, and what his role is he would basically have to train and then choose which of the cadets would be part of this exclusive special forces branch, right? And, so he would always, the data wise, right, you can look at who's fastest, who's quickest, who's strongest, all of these sort of things. You can also look at some of the more intangibles, like who works the hardest, who's really putting their effort into all of this. And, usually he said, okay, you get this, you have 100 cadets and you have to pick 5, right? Usually the first 1, 2, and 3 are pretty obvious, right? You can see their performance, they're going to definitely be part of the special forces. But then like number 4 and number 5 are somewhat trickier, right? Because you're now comparing some people who like are really, really great, other people who are also really great, but maybe a little bit lower, but like, really showed you something. They had something in them that like, and so there's one guy that he was talking about, and he was like, he really did everything. He did everything right. And there was like no reason for me to not put him in the special forces. But for some reason, I was just struggling. I was just really struggling because, there were some limitations that I saw, but he was just trying so hard. He really wanted it. He was doing everything to kind of get to that point. And his commanding officer was like, well, why are you struggling so much? And he's like, I don't know. I just can't put my finger on it. I really don't know what to do. So you tell me, should I put him in or should I not put him in? And his commanding officer was like, I can't tell you. I can't make that decision. But why don't you flip a coin? And he was like, what? Flip a coin? And he's like, just flip a coin. Right. And so he flipped the coin and he's like, heads, he's in. Tails, he's not in. Right. And so it was heads. Right. And he flipped the coin and he's like, okay, I guess he's in. And the commanding officer like, well, how do you feel? And he's like, I don't know. I wish it was tails. And he goes, there's your answer. Right. So it's like, we sometimes need that, like, okay, well, now what do you really think? Right. Because we're like so used to pro-con lists. We're so used to that analysis. We're so used to all of these other things. Right. Well, flip a coin. Now it's heads. You have the answer. But if you're like, oh, I'm so glad it was heads, you've made that. Okay, now my gut feel is in line, right? But if you're like, it's heads, and now like, I wish it was tails, right? There's that clarity that's trying to tell you something, right? And now, and it was like, and then he realized, oh, you know what? Like, I'm putting this person in charge of other people's lives, right? Like I have to know that in a life or death situation, that this is the absolute best person that's going to be out there. And for whatever reason, I have a hesitancy. I have this hesitancy that this is not that right person. And all of that sort of clarity comes into play once he had that moment where he could kind of make that decision, you know? And so, you know, it also kind of reminds me of like, there was this Friends episode where, you know, I don't know if you watched Friends back in the
every
day.
episode,
okay,
yes.
so there was this Friends episode that it always reminds me of where Rachel was, she didn't know if she was pregnant or not, right? She had taken a pregnancy test and it said it was, you know, she wasn't sure if she was pregnant or not. She had taken pregnancy tests and whatever. And so there's this scene where Phoebe, you know, she's like, okay, we're going to just take one more pregnancy test, right? And she was so upset about being pregnant, right? Because she's like, oh, like I'm not married and all this sort of stuff. And like, you know, what do I do? I'm now pregnant. And so Phoebe's like, okay, let's take one more pregnancy test, right? Because it's been inconclusive. You're so upset about this. You're so upset about the fact that you might be pregnant. And so she takes it. And then Rachel's like, I can't look. I'm too nervous. And Phoebe's like, you're not pregnant. And then Rachel's like, really? Oh, okay. And then she realizes how upset she is because, you know, and then Phoebe was like, just kidding, you are pregnant, right? And Rachel's like, what? And then like they're crying, they're all joyful because, you know, there was this like coin flip moment, right? Also super risky to do this, but like, you know, but Phoebe kind of, her gut feel, she knew that Rachel would be happy about this and she needed to kind of give her that mechanism, right? So this is what I sort of mean. Like, there's not like a definitive right or wrong answer, right? You don't know the counterfactual, but you have this way of allowing it to manifest for you in a way that's actually going to make sense.
I want to push back on that a little bit though. I wonder how much of that is actually loss aversion. Because you have something where
this loss aversion sort of you love I can tell you're someone who like really the losses are much more powerful or much more painful to you than the gains.
Oh, it's not necessarily that's the case for me. I'm very aware of it just because I'm like a fanatic with, you know, psychological frameworks and biases. Yeah. And this is just such a common trait in humans. And I just find it that it's across all different forms of careers and decisions that we make. So I'm just really fascinated by it personally. But I wonder how much of that is like you flip a coin and the fact that you actually maybe wanted both options. You're just kind of, maybe you were 50-50, but the fact that the outcome wasn't actually what you wanted as part of that is the reason why you want it more. It's kind of like you maybe don't like someone and then that person says, okay, well, I'm just going to go date someone else. And then you're like, oh, maybe I did like that person, but you don't know if it's really because you really like them or it's because the fact that you're losing them.
Yeah, that second guessing is where the loss aversion really comes from, right? So my good friend Annie Duke talks a little bit about something called resulting. So Annie was a professional poker player. And she talks about the fact that we sometimes like look back on what the hand was versus what we think it could, right? So we think back on like, we do a lot of what she calls resulting, which is we look backwards and think about what it was rather than did we play the hand the right way? And, you know, that's that action piece of it again. Like we don't know the counterfactual, right? So we don't know what would have happened if we hadn't folded. Maybe somebody would have bluffed us. Somebody might have, maybe if you're playing Texas Hold'em, the river card would have been a different one. You just don't know all of those sort of things. And so like loss aversion is something that we consciously think about after the fact, but that's no different from doing like, a company postmortem when you think about like what we could have done. And I think that's actually part of our gut feel. It's helping us hone what we're thinking about, right? So like something that I always recommend is like when you're making a big decision, in your life, write down what that decision was and how you came to it. And then 3 months later, revisit it and see like what ended up happening, right? So sometimes in some cases, you might be like, oh, I should have done this, but why? Why was it because you didn't listen to a certain thing that you were thinking? Was it because somebody else was telling you to do this? Was it because you were pulled by status symbols and whatever the other things that might have been out there? And so I always say, like, part of gut feel is we need to be better at listening to what whispers and not what screams. We're so good at listening to what screams, and we don't even notice some of the things that are screaming at us because there are things that are physically loud in our world, right? Vacuum machines, dishwashers, like fire, ambulances, things like that. But there are also lots of things that are loud, like algorithms. They're like AI, like we can't even watch a YouTube video anymore without getting recommended the next YouTube video that's in line for us based on what the algorithm thinks we want. When we make decisions, what do? The first thing we do is we like pick up the phone and call somebody and say, hey, like I'm struggling with this decision. What do you think? Right. And throughout our lives, what we do is like, anytime there's a big decision, we fill the chairs, right? It's like we're having a dinner party and we fill the chairs with all of these different people that we trust and we value, but we don't often do the equivalent of saving one of those seats for ourselves and our own voice. And so, back to your original question, I think loss aversion comes from all of these other voices that are like, oh, well, you should have done this, or this would have been a better outcome, rather than listening to what whispers and our own voice and thinking what it is we actually wanted, right? I've seen so many people who are 60, 70 years old and end up becoming miserable shells of people because they're like, well, there's this thing I wanted to do when I was 25, but I was so worried about this and that. And then, the next bonus was coming and the next shares were vesting and this and that. And now all of a sudden I'm 65 and it's too late, right? And so I always say it's totally fine to wait. We all have responsibilities. We've got mortgages. We've got kids. We've all these things. Totally fine to wait, but just don't wait too long. And gut feel is one of those things that can continue to steer you in not waiting too long, in remembering and keeping that, because when we know what whispers to us, it continues to whisper, even if we're sort of shoving it aside. And so, I don't really think about it in terms of losses and gains. I really think about it as like a path. I think about it as like, if you are going from point A to point B and you don't end up exactly at point B, sure, you can see that as a loss, but I really see it as like, you're just going for directionality. Rather than trying to go from point A to point B, all I'm trying to do and all gut feel is steering you to do is to go in the direction of one of the quadrants, right? You go in one of those quadrants and you're going to end up making the path right for yourself, right? You're going to bob and weave and you're going to pivot and you're going to change, and you might not end up at exactly point B, but you're going to end up in that quadrant, and you might be much better off in where you end up, rather than specifically looking at that point and thinking, am I higher than that point or lower than that point? Did I experience loss? Did I experience gain? It's much more holistic.
Yeah, I love what you said about the fact that we often need to listen to the things that are whispering at us rather than the things that are screaming at us, because that's a really hard thing to do. From my personal experience, a month ago, I did a 3-day dark retreat. I don't know if you've heard of this. And it was the first time in my life. For people that don't know, you're just in a room by yourself in the dark. You can't see anything. I decided to fast as well, so that I'm just completely in mental clarity. And it's the first time where I didn't have any of my senses distracting me. So there was no light. I couldn't hear anything, no smell, no taste, no touch. And it was such a profound experience of things that were kind of like lingering that I had, of ideas and thoughts and things that I wanted to do that were whispering throughout the years. It just started to come up because I wasn't looking at my phone. I wasn't being recommended through different algorithms or getting advice from someone else. It was just me and myself. And it was just fascinating to like to hone that instinct or that intuition over time. Obviously, not a lot of people can do this on their own and take 3 days off and be in the dark. So for people that are living normal day lives, what are some of the key ways that you found to help people hone their intuition?
Yeah. So you can recognize your own signals to yourself in similar ways too, right? So what you really did was sort of eliminate, you went into pitch black, right? You eliminated all of those sort of senses just to see what, because if you take all of the noise out, that signal, right, kind of sticks out. And so in my research, I have lots of different ways that you can do something similar, but recognize, for example, your own physical prompts, right? So an example of this is like a lot of therapists, they might have people that they're working with that have been, they experience gaslighting their whole lives, right? So they don't even know what to trust anymore, right? They don't know what's true and what's false. And so what some of these therapists do is that they try and baseline again, right? And that's similar to what you're talking about, is like kind of baselining. So they might say like, they might bring that person into their office and they say, okay, well, like, what is your name, right? Like, my name is Sean. My name is Sean. Okay. And so like, it's a truth, right? Something that you know fundamentally to be true. And so they'll say, okay, Sean, where did you feel that? Right? Where did you, and maybe you're not noticing where you feel that, but then they might be like, Sean, okay, do you have kids? Yes, I have 2 kids. That's another truth, right? And so you start to baseline and feel like those fundamental truths. Where do you feel that? Okay. Then one of my good friends, Erin, she's a therapist, and she's like, then I have them say the same thing. It doesn't matter who they are, right? And I just say, like, I have them say, hi, my name is Penelope Princess, right? Or something cute like that. My name is Penelope Princess. And like, they laugh, they giggle, they think it's funny, but she makes them all say that. Well, that's fundamentally a lie, right? They know that that's a lie. And so even though they're laughing, she's like, okay, where do you feel that? Right. And so through a series of kind of this like baseline, you start to understand, where do you feel your truth? Where do you feel your lies? And so physically you start to identify and notice those whispers that your body is physically sort of telling you, right? You can do the same thing, not just with where you feel things physically. You can talk about where you feel things emotionally, right? And you and I have talked in the past about this emotions piece, right? And a lot of times emotions are tricky because we feel all sorts of emotions all the time. Like, we might be like excited about something, we might be nervous about something else, we might feel like some sort of sense of urgency or panic or something. And a lot of times we also haven't baselined our emotions. Like, we don't know necessarily. We let our emotions steer us. We let the emotions be really loud. We let the emotions be something that are screaming at us rather than using the emotions as something that whispers, right? And so that's one of the ways where our gut feel sometimes does lead us astray, is because of our emotions. And so, one way to think about this, and that I describe in, is that, think about emotions. Like, emotions are like children, right? They're like children because you don't want them driving the car, right? You don't let your children drive the car because they'll crash it. But you also don't shove your emotions or your children in the trunk, right? You don't shove your children in the trunk because they might die, right? So you want them in the back seat where they are sort of seen and heard and attended to, but they're not really fully in control of anything. Right. And I think this, when we think about that, right, in terms of emotions, it's really, really right. We're not supposed to suppress our emotions. We don't stick them in the trunk, but we don't also let them steer and control everything. We give them the right seat. They're a part of the process. They're a part of the intuiting process, but they're not the outcome. They're not the end all be all. Right. And so how do you tell them apart? Well, one of the ways you can tell them apart is by sort of asking yourself, when you do feel those heightened emotions, asking yourself, am I acting from clarity, right? Or am I acting from a feeling that I haven't yet named? And, if I were completely calm, would I still be making this decision, right? And as you start to practice this, you start to realize, right, if the answer is yes, right? If I would make the same decision without the emotion, or whether, with naming that emotion, then it's probably your gut feel. But if the answer is no, then it's probably your emotion trying to take the front seat, and lead you astray. And so, you can also like give it 24 hours, right? Like if it's truly your gut feel, that clarity will remain. If it's just emotion, that urgency will fade, right? Just like sugar highs fade. But we don't always have the benefit of the 24 hours, right? So we can start to like hone our emotions and recognize our emotions in this way, so that gut feel starts to be the compass, right? The emotions are sort of along for the ride and part of that.
Yeah, that's a great point. I love the idea of just giving it time, even with ideas, right? So many of us have an idea and we think it's going to be the next like $1 billion idea, and we want to pursue it, and then we forget about it and never really comes back. But oftentimes the best ideas, they come back to us over time, right? After a month, after a year, we can't stop thinking about it. And it's generally a good intuition field to like pursue that idea, rather than an idea you're super excited about and then it just kind of disappears.
As long as we are listening to those whispers, right? As long as we're not like, oh, you know what, never mind, I'm just going to like shut that sort of that whisper, and it's like, and it's very true. Like the founder of a company called Farm Girl Flowers once told me, she was like, I once asked her, I was like, how did you know, right? How did you know, like, was it your gut feel that told you that it was time to do this? Like that you had been thinking about this idea and you wanted to do this. How did you know that it was time for you to quit your full-time job, right? And do this and do this startup that you had no idea whether it was going to be successful or not. And she told me, she said, it wasn't about deciding that I was going to do this. It was the fact that I couldn't, that it was more about I couldn't not do it. There was a whisper that kept coming back to me that told me I couldn't not do this, right? And so even as she continued to gather data, even as she continued to think through this, there was something that told her she couldn't not do this, right? And I always think that that's something that's pretty, that illustrates this in a little bit of a way, right? It's not the urgency. It wasn't that she felt like it was that she felt like she couldn't not do it.
Yeah, I love that idea of inversion. I want to shift gears a little bit to edge, because that's obviously a very big part of things that you talk about. And often we talk about this idea through edge that working hard itself isn't enough. You even brought up this idea of your friend that had to choose the I forget exactly what the position was, but the military leader.
Yeah.
And they were probably both very qualified on paper, both worked very hard.
Yeah.
But there was something about one of them that made your friend want to choose the other person just through intuition. Do you think this phrase of work hard and success will follow is somewhat a misleading advice for young people?
Yeah. I mean, hard work is critical. I would never say that hard work is not critical, but there is a myth of meritocracy in the sense that hard work alone is never going to be enough. And I think that's a really important distinction, right? So very, very early in my research, the way that a lot of this kicked off even with me studying edge, like who gains an edge, who has an advantage, and also around gut feel, like how do we sort of the precursor to that, trusting ourselves. My earliest research, I was just looking at success, just generally what makes people successful. And I was interviewing hundreds, thousands of individuals who were successful and asking them, like, what do they think made them successful? And so I was interviewing not just traditional definitions of success, but I certainly was interviewing those, right? People who had won Olympic gold medals, people who had broken world records, CEOs of companies, entrepreneurs who had taken their companies public, all sorts of the traditional definitions of success. But also people who had accomplished non-traditional definitions of success, right? So formerly incarcerated individuals who were able to get back on their feet, women who had been out of the workplace for decades and were able to get back on their feet, right? And everything in between. And the one thing that every single person mentioned was hard work, right? Everyone said, 100% of the people said that hard work was the secret to their success. And yet, 100% of the people, every single one of them, when I would scratch under the surface a little bit and probe a little bit more, every single one of them admitted to me that they didn't believe that hard work alone was enough, right? That you could take two different people who work equally as hard, and one would inevitably be more successful than the other. And they knew that it was because there's all sorts of different perceptions and signals and nuances that are out, and stereotypes that are out there that are determining who actually will be successful or not. And so the only other factor that was common across all of these successful individuals was their ability to gain an edge. And that's why I wrote the book around edge and turning adversity into advantage. Because what I found was what was making every single one of these individuals successful was that they were able to take constraints and adversity and stereotypes and all sorts of things and flip them in their favor. That they would be able to take barriers and constraints and adversity and flip it in their favor to give themselves an edge. And so that book was really, and that research is all around how do we gain an edge by taking those constraints and taking those stereotypes and actually using them in our favor. And what I found was that it was their ability to enrich and really know where they brought value in any sort of circumstance that they were in, and be able to sort of contextualize that they knew that they brought value in different ways. So that's the E, right? It actually stands for the framework. The E, D, G, and E and edge actually stand for the components of it, right? The first was enrich. The second was delight. The D stood for delight, which is that everyone sort of understood their authentic way, that they had an authentic way of delighting their customers, delighting their counterparts, delighting their suppliers, to anyone that they were interacting with. They sort of knew that they had a unique way of delighting. And it wasn't just positive or negative, but that was something that was very intuitive, right? And so that's how it connects sometimes with the gut feel. The G stood for guide, which is that they knew how to guide, even given how they enrich and delight, they could constantly be guiding the perceptions of others, and not in a way that was like extra emotional labor, but in a way it wasn't extra emotional labor at all. It was something that was, again, very authentic and natural to them. And then the final E stood for effort and hard work, which is one of the components, right? It's critical, but it comes last. Because what I found was that when they knew how they enriched and delight and guide, that's when their effort and hard work would actually work harder for them. That's when they would get the tailwinds, right? That's when, instead of, we always hear like, put your head down and work hard. Your hard work will speak for itself. Put your head down, even if you work twice as hard for half the amount of benefits. Well, I found that when you know how you enrich and delight and guide, why work twice as hard for half the amount of benefits? You can work twice as hard for 2 times the amount of benefits, or even 3 times the amount of benefits. And that's what you get when you know how you enrich and delight and guide, so that you get that hard work plus.
Yeah, it's a very counterintuitive thing for me personally. I don't know if you were born in the US, but I grew up in Korea, and it's a very conservative, traditional Korean family background where, you were just kind of taught to put your head down, roll up your sleeves, study really hard, work really hard, don't stand out too much. And, eventually you'll have some success in life. And it was very different, moving to the States and Canada, where people talk about not just hard work, but it's who you know, and it's how you present yourself and all of these different things. Do you think there is cultural differences of edge and how people talk about it?
I mean, absolutely. And I think that there's something really around like the immigrant mentality, right? The immigrant hard work, hustle sort of mentality. And look, again, hard work is critical, right? I would never say that hard work is not critical. And if you work really, really hard and you put in twice the amount of effort, you're still going to end up okay, right? You're still gonna reap some benefits of that hard work. But what I really wanted to study was the fact that there are all these other dynamics that are happening where that hard work is not always enough, that you see that there is differential success based on many, many other factors, right? And so I would see, for example, that people who had accents, like what was considered a non-standard accent, were less likely to get promoted, less likely to get raises, less likely to get hired for certain top management positions, less likely to get funding. And it was so sort of, and even though they were working really, really hard, and it was sort of really depressing for me. And so that's why a lot of my research was like, well, are there things that we can do? Are there ways that we can inoculate against this, right? Because yes, they're working hard and they may accomplish a certain level of success, but they're still not sort of getting those outcomes that they're really striving to get. And so I wanted to study what are ways in which they can really be still, not necessarily having to change their accent, but embracing their accent and using that as an asset so that they could gain an edge, right? And what I found was that there are ways in which people who, for example, have an accent, or people who are certain gender, certain race, ethnicity, class, religion, education background, and so on and so forth, all of the typical cast of characters that we think about, that we can be able to, when we understand that and understand the underlying perceptions that people have of us, be able to flip that in our favor. And so what I then found was that when I worked with some of these accented individuals and I tested some of my research and all of that, that not only were they more likely to get the job, but sometimes they were 75, 80% more likely to get the job than those who didn't have accents, that they were able to actually gain an edge over those folks.
And I guess ultimately this is somewhat of this idea of guiding someone's perception of us.
Yeah.
Where do you think that crosses the line in terms of this idea of fake it till you make it? I think you had an article about this as well. Can you kind of delineate where the line is?
Yeah. I mean, this is a very authentic thing, right? It's not about faking it. It's not about being strategic. It's not about managing impressions. Like we've all had those experiences where we see somebody sort of like kissing up to the boss and we're like, ugh, that just like feels gross. Like, I don't want to do this. It's actually the opposite of that, right? I'll sort of explain it in a couple of ways. I mean, I guess the first is like, we often hear the advice, like, be yourself, right? And that runs so much in contrast with fake it till you make it. And I actually think both pieces of advice are horrible advice, right? So be yourself is actually also horrible advice, but not for the reasons why you think I'm going to say. Be yourself is horrible advice because who you are with your mother is very different from who you are with your best friend. And that's really different from who you are with one of your coworkers, for example. And yet you can still be yourself with each of those people. You can be yourself with your mother. You can be yourself with your best friend. You can be yourself with your coworker. And yet you're still very, very different with each of those sort of audiences. And so be yourself, it doesn't really mean anything. It doesn't tell us anything, right? It's just sort of be yourselves. And that's no different from sort of like fake it to some extent, right? Instead, it's sort of like, think about it like each individual person is like a diamond, right? Like, okay, this sounds a little bit trite, but you are a diamond. You are a single solitary diamond, as is every single person. And every diamond has different cuts and flaws and coloring and different facets and different ways that it's going to shine based on the lighting in the room and the environmental condition and the mix of people that are looking at it and from what angles. And so anytime you interact with someone, your only job really is to show the angle of your diamond that's going to shine the brightest. You're still the same diamond. You still have the same cuts and flaws and facets and coloring and all those sort of things. But when you're showing that angle of your diamond that shines the brightest, you're acknowledging a couple of things. Number one, you're acknowledging, how you enrich, how you provide value. You know the underlying perceptions from which that other person is looking at you from. You know how you can sort of guide, like change the angle of that diamond. You know how you're delighting. You know how you're shining, all of those things. And when you do that, that's when you're going to have the deepest, richest interpersonal connection with someone. That's when you're still the exact same diamond. You are who you are, and you're not doing it in a way that you're faking it, but you're just showing that version of yourself, yourselves, right? That angle of your diamond that's going to shine the brightest. And when you're doing this, it's so authentic because, my friend Arlen Hamilton always says, like, you have to be yourself because otherwise, you have to sort of show that angle. Otherwise, how are the people who are looking for you going to find you? Right. And so, like, you have to be who you are, because there are those people who are trying to find you. They're trying to, but they're not going to find you unless they see something that's bright, something that's whatever, that part of your diamond that's going to shine brightest. And then they're going to want to ask lots of questions. They're going to want to know what else is in your diamond. But if you're faking it, the people who are actually looking for you are not going to be able to find you. They're going to be finding someone else. They're going to be finding that person who you are faking that persona of.
Right. Yeah. Because I guess everyone wants someone, and whether it's working with them or clients that they can relate to, and faking it just might present this too much of a perfect picture that people can see through, because nobody's perfect. So I think that makes a lot of sense, particularly around this idea of kind of shining the bright parts of yourself, given that time is finite. Like, you could, after 3 years, if you decided not to do this, eventually people are going to find some positive things about you, but you're not going to have 3 years to work with a client, to have a job interview, and all these different things. So you're just kind of packaging it in some ways and putting that up front, somewhere where people can actually notice things about you, so that you can get the outcome that you want. So I think makes a lot of sense, because that's kind of what I thought people I didn't want people to get the idea of like fake it till you make it, because I don't think that's the idea that you're trying to provide.
No, not at all. It's the opposite of that. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, Laura, I really appreciate your time here, and
my pleasure.
Really loved this discussion between edge, intuition, gut feeling. Where can people learn more about you to discover your books? Obviously, we'll have those linked down below. But where can people learn more about your work and what you do?
Yeah. I mean, I think I do lots of articles. I continue to write about this. So one place is my Substack newsletter. So if you're interested in this sort of thing, every week I have 1 or 2 articles coming out where I talk more about this, other ways that you can gain your edge, other ways that you can find your edge, ways that you can continue to hone your intuition and your gut feel. So it's called Between the Lines. It's my Substack article. You can also find me on my website, proflaurahuang.com. I'm also on all socials that you can imagine, Prof. Laura Huang. So please also pick up a copy of, if this is interesting to you, please pick up a copy of my book, which is called You Already Know. Do you
have it in front of you here, just to show people what it looks like?
I don't. It's a it's a blue
one.
cover.
Yeah.
It's a blue cover, and I actually even had a post that I love, which is that, I don't know if you've seen this, but there was people walk into bookstores and libraries all the time, and they're like, I don't remember the name of the book, but I remember it was blue. Right. And so, the librarians are then like, okay. And so I loved that. And so I have a post about the fact that my cover is blue. And anyways, it's called You Already Know: The Science of Mastering Your Intuition. So
beautiful. Yeah. We'll have all that linked down below so people can check it out.
Awesome.
Awesome. Laura, appreciate you. And thanks so much for coming on.
Yeah. My pleasure. Take care.
Awesome.